The cantina fell silent as Zixthera's clawed hand trembled around his drink. The amber liquid sloshed against the glass walls, creating tiny waves that caught the dim light. Around him, younger soldiers leaned forward, their multifaceted eyes gleaming with curiosity. They had heard whispers, fragments of stories about the human war, but never from someone who had actually been there. Zixthera was old now. His once proud, chitinous armor dulled and scarred. 3 of his 6 arms bore visible battle damage, and his left antenna had been severed halfway down its length. The veterans knew those marks. They knew what kind of enemy could leave such wounds on a Kethlarian warrior. You want to know about humans? Zixthera's voice carried the weight of 1,000 nightmares. You young fools think you understand war because you fought the Crystalline Collective or skirmished with Void pirates. You know nothing. A young lieutenant, his carapace still gleaming with newness, shifted uncomfortably. With respect, Elder, we've studied the tactical reports. Humans are primitive. They lack our superior technology, our hive coordination, our centuries of military evolution. Zixthera's laugh was bitter, like metal scraping against stone. Primitive. Yes, that's what we thought too. The High Command called it a cleanup operation. 7 cycles to pacify a single star system. We brought 3 full battle fleets against 1 small blue world. He took a long drink, his secondary throat working to process the alcohol. The memories were always clearer when he drank. Unfortunately, I was a battle coordinator then, commanding the strike cruiser Infinite Resolve. My tactical matrix was state-of-the-art. My crew the finest the hegemony could produce. We had fought 12 successful campaigns against various species. The humans were supposed to be our 13th easy victory. The cantina had grown completely quiet now. Even the background music had stopped, as if the establishment itself was holding its breath. The first sign something was wrong came when we dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of their system. Our long-range sensors detected massive energy signatures throughout the asteroid belt. The humans had somehow militarized their entire outer system in the cycles since first contact. Mining stations had been converted into weapons platforms. Cargo haulers bristled with missile pods. Zixthera's mandibles clicked nervously, a sound that made several younger soldiers flinch. But it was their communications that truly unsettled us. Most species, when faced with overwhelming force, attempt to negotiate or surrender. Humans did neither. Instead, their transmissions were filled with what our translators called defiance protocols. They weren't begging for mercy or offering tribute. They were promising to make us pay for every inch of space we took. A female officer with bright blue markings spoke up. Surely their primitive weapons couldn't threaten modern warships. That's what Admiral Kethvar thought. He ordered a direct assault on their homeworld, expecting minimal resistance. The human fleet that met us was smaller than ours, their ships crude by our standards. We should have swept them aside like debris. Zixthera's compound eyes seemed to look through the walls of the cantina, seeing battles that happened decades ago. The first human ship we destroyed was called Defiance, a small frigate that should have been vaporized by our opening salvo, but instead of dying quietly, it rammed straight into our forward dreadnought. The explosion tore through 3 decks and killed 40 crew members. We thought it was an accident, a navigation malfunction. He paused, his breathing becoming labored. Then the second human ship did the same thing. And the third, we realized with growing horror that this wasn't malfunction or panic. This was strategy. They were using their own ships as weapons, turning every vessel into a potential suicide bomb. The young lieutenant's confidence was beginning to crack, but ramming attacks are inefficient. The loss ratios would be catastrophic for them. You're thinking like a Kethlarian, Zixthera replied. You're thinking about acceptable losses, about preserving resources for future campaigns. Humans don't think that way. For them, there was no future campaign. There was only this moment, this battle, this absolute refusal to surrender their world. He finished his drink and immediately signaled for another. The bartender, a nervous glimmering who had been listening from across the room, quickly complied. By the end of the first engagement, we had lost 2 capital ships and taken heavy damage to 6 others. The humans had lost their entire outer system defense fleet. By any reasonable military calculation, we had won a decisive victory. But something felt wrong. The ease of it. The way they had thrown their lives away so readily. It didn't feel like victory at all. Zixthera's voice dropped to almost a whisper, forcing everyone to lean closer. That night, as we regrouped and planned our assault on the inner system, our intelligence division intercepted human communications. What we heard changed everything. They weren't mourning their dead or preparing to surrender. They were celebrating. The humans were actually celebrating the destruction of their own fleet. "That's impossible," breathed the young lieutenant. The translation matrix worked perfectly. They called it buying time. Every ship that had died ramming ours had delayed our advance by precious hours. Hours they used to prepare defenses that would make our previous engagement look like a training exercise. Zixthara accepted his new drink with a grateful nod. Around him, the cantina had filled with an oppressive silence. Even the bartender had stopped pretending to clean glasses. That's when I first understood what we were really fighting. Not just another species defending their territory, but something fundamentally different from anything we had encountered. These humans didn't fight to win. They fought to make losing as costly as possible for their enemies. And they were very, very good at it. The second drink burned less than the first, but Zixthara's hands still shook as he set the glass down. The younger soldiers around him had grown quiet, their earlier bravado replaced by uncomfortable silence. They could sense that the real horror was yet to come. The assault on Earth's moon was supposed to be simple, Zixthara continued, his voice carrying the weight of old pain. Our intelligence suggested it was barely defended, just a few research stations and mining operations. We thought taking it would give us a staging ground for the final assault on their homeworld. He paused, his damaged antenna twitching involuntarily. The humans had turned their moon into a fortress. Not just defensive positions, but the entire satellite had been weaponized. They had spent generations preparing for this moment, hollowing out sections and filling them with weapons we couldn't even categorize. A young communications officer with silver markings interrupted. "But Elder, our shields should have protected us from primitive projectile weapons." Zixthara's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Primitive? Young one. The humans had taken their industrial capacity and focused it entirely on killing us. They didn't just build weapons. They built weapons designed specifically to counter our technology, our tactics, our very nature as a species." He gestured with one of his scarred arms, the limb moving stiffly. They had studied every battle we had ever fought, analyzed every tactical decision, every weakness in our armor and strategy. When we approached their moon, they hit us with electromagnetic pulse weapons that disrupted our navigation systems. But not randomly. They had calculated exactly how our ships would drift, where we would be vulnerable. The cantina's atmosphere had grown thick with tension. Several patrons had quietly moved closer, drawn by the veterans' words despite their fear. As our fleet struggled to regain control, the moon's surface erupted. Massive railguns hidden beneath false craters began firing projectiles at velocities we thought impossible for their technology level. But these weren't ordinary projectiles. They were designed to fragment at specific distances, creating debris clouds that our point defense systems couldn't track. Zixthara's compound eyes glazed over, lost in the memory. I watched the cruiser Eternal Victory get torn apart by what looked like gravel. Thousands of tiny impacts, each one precisely calculated to hit weak points in our armor. The humans had turned space itself into a weapon. One of the female officers leaned forward. How did they coordinate such complex attacks without our hive mind capabilities? That was perhaps the most terrifying thing, Zixthara replied. They didn't coordinate like us. Instead of one controlling intelligence, they had thousands of independent units, each making their own decisions, each adapting to changing conditions in real time. When we destroyed one of their command centers, the others didn't fall into chaos. They got angry. He took another drink, the liquid doing little to steady his nerves. Anger, we learned, was the human's greatest weapon, not the cold calculation of our war computers, not the instinctive pack behavior of the Karnax hunters, pure, focused rage that turned ordinary soldiers into something beyond rational. They stopped retreating when retreat was logical. They stopped conserving ammunition when conservation was wise. They simply kept fighting until they died or we did. The young lieutenant who had been so confident earlier was now pale, his carapace dulled with stress. But surely with our superior numbers and technology we eventually overwhelmed them. Zixthara's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. Overwhelmed them? Child, we never even reached the surface. The humans had prepared something they called the last resort, nuclear weapons but not fired at us directly. They detonated them in their own moon's core. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the mechanical hum of the cantina's ventilation system seemed to pause. They cracked their own moon rather than let us take it. The explosion created a debris field that lasted for cycles, making any approach to their homeworld impossible. But more than that, the radiation signature sent a message that every species in the galaxy received loud and clear. The humans would rather destroy everything than surrender anything. Zixthara's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. 43,000 Kethalarian warriors died in that debris field. Not from enemy fire, but from chunks of rock and metal that had once been a peaceful moon. The humans had turned their own celestial body into a weapon and used it to kill more of our soldiers than any conventional battle. He looked around the cantina, meeting the eyes of each young soldier in turn, and through it all their radio transmissions continued. Not calls for help or desperate pleas for mercy. They were singing. War songs, they called them. Ancient melodies about fighting against impossible odds and dying on their feet rather than living on their knees. The bartender, who had been listening with growing horror, accidentally dropped a glass. The sound of shattering crystal echoed through the quiet room like a gunshot. The worst part, Zixthara continued, was realizing that this had all been planned. The moon fortress, the nuclear self-destruction, even the psychological impact of their war songs. The humans had studied us so thoroughly that they knew exactly how to hurt us, not just physically but mentally. They understood that seeing an entire world choose death over defeat would haunt us forever. One of the younger soldiers, a technician with nervous tremors in his secondary arms, spoke up. But the war didn't end there, did it, Elder? Zixthara's expression grew darker, if such a thing was possible. No, young one. The destruction of their moon was just the beginning. After that, we learned what humans were truly capable of when they had nothing left to lose. Zixthara ordered another drink, his third, though the bartender hesitated before serving it. The old veteran's memories were clearly taking a toll, but the young soldiers around him hung on every word. They needed to understand what they might face if humanity ever decided the current peace treaty wasn't worth maintaining. After the moon's destruction, High Command made a critical mistake, Zixthara began, his voice slurring slightly. They assumed the humans were finished, that destroying their own defensive position meant they had exhausted their options. Admiral Kethvar ordered a direct assault on Earth itself, confident that our remaining 2 fleets could overwhelm any surface defenses. He paused, his scarred antenna twitching as he relived the memory. We should have recognized the trap. The humans had been too quiet after their moon's destruction, their radio transmissions limited to brief coded messages. Our intelligence division interpreted this as evidence of a demoralized population preparing for surrender. A young engineer with bright green markings spoke up nervously. What were they actually doing during that silence? Preparing hell, Zixthara replied without hesitation. While we were regrouping and planning our final assault, the humans were transforming their entire planet into a weapon. Every city, every military base, every civilian installation was being converted into what they called denial positions. The veterans' compound eyes grew distant. We learned later that they had distributed something called the Scorched Earth Protocol to every human settlement. If capture was inevitable, they were to destroy everything of value rather than let it fall into enemy hands. But the humans took this concept further than any species we had ever encountered. He took a long drink, the alcohol doing little to numb the pain of remembrance. When our assault ships entered Earth's atmosphere, we expected to face conventional defenses. Anti-aircraft weapons, military installations, perhaps some civilian resistance. Instead, we encountered something that defied all military logic. The cantina had grown so quiet that the sound of Zixthara's breathing seemed loud. The humans had weaponized their own infrastructure. Their power plants had been rigged to overload when we approached, creating electromagnetic pulses that disabled our electronics. Their transportation networks had been turned into massive explosive traps. Even their agricultural areas had been contaminated with biological agents that made the land unusable for generations. One of the female officers leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper. They poisoned their own world? Worse than that, Zixthara replied. They turned their entire civilization into a trap designed to kill as many invaders as possible, while denying us any benefit from conquest. The humans had calculated that even if they lost, they could make victory so costly that we would never again consider attacking another species. His mandibles clicked nervously as he continued. My strike team was assigned to capture their primary military command center in a place called Washington. Our intelligence suggested it would be heavily defended but ultimately conquerable. We landed with 2 full battalions of our finest warriors. The old veteran's voice began to shake. The building was empty when we arrived. Completely abandoned. No soldiers, no equipment, no intelligence data. Just empty corridors and the echo of our own footsteps. We thought the humans had retreated, leaving us an easy victory. He paused, his breathing becoming labored. Then the building exploded. Not from external attack, but from charges placed throughout the structure by the humans themselves before they evacuated. They had turned their own command center into a massive bomb, timed to detonate when our scanning equipment indicated maximum occupancy. The young lieutenant from earlier had gone completely pale. How many casualties? 237 Kethalarian warriors died in that explosion. Sixathera replied, his voice heavy with grief. The humans had sacrificed their most important military installation just to kill a few hundred of our soldiers. By any reasonable calculation, it was a terrible trade for them. But they didn't care about reasonable calculations. He gestured with one of his damaged arms. This limb was crushed under falling debris from that building. I spent 3 cycles in medical rehabilitation, listening to reports from other strike teams. Every single landing site had been the same. Empty buildings rigged to explode. Abandoned equipment booby-trapped with explosive devices. Even their food supplies contaminated with toxins designed to poison our biology specifically. The bartender, unable to contain his curiosity any longer, spoke up. But Elder, surely your superior technology allowed you to detect these traps. Zixthara's laugh was bitter. Our technology was designed to fight conventional enemies who valued their own resources. The humans had abandoned all conventional thinking. They were using tactics that required them to destroy everything they had built, everything they valued, just to kill a few of us. His voice dropped to almost a whisper, but the worst part was their civilians. We expected non-combatants to flee or surrender when faced with our forces. Instead, human civilians armed themselves with whatever they could find and attacked our patrols. Old females with explosive devices strapped to their bodies. Young males using chemical weapons made from household supplies. Even their younglings threw burning liquids at our vehicles. One of the younger soldiers shifted uncomfortably. But civilians can't seriously threaten trained military forces. You're wrong, Zixthera replied firmly. A civilian with nothing left to lose is more dangerous than any professional soldier. They don't follow rules of engagement. They don't try to preserve their own lives. They simply attack until they die, or you do, and there were billions of them. He finished his drink and stared at the empty glass. Every street was a battlefield. Every building was a potential fortress. Every human we encountered, from the youngest to the oldest, was a potential enemy. We weren't fighting an army anymore. We were fighting an entire species that had chosen death over defeat. The cantina had become so quiet that the sound of distant traffic from outside seemed deafening. The young soldiers around Zixthara sat in stunned silence, trying to process the implications of what they were hearing. That's when I began to understand what we were truly facing, the old veteran continued. Not just another species defending their territory, but a form of warfare that broke every rule we thought we understood. The humans had turned their entire civilization into a weapon designed to make victory impossible, even for a vastly superior force. The 4th drink arrived without Zixthara having to ask. The bartender had learned to read the old veteran's needs, understanding that some memories required chemical assistance to share. Around the cantina, more patrons had gathered, drawn by whispers of the human war stories. Even older veterans had stopped their own conversations to listen. 3 cycles into the ground campaign, we controlled approximately 60% of Earth's surface, Zixthara continued, his voice growing increasingly strained. By every military metric, we were winning. Our casualty reports showed manageable losses. Our territorial gains were substantial, and human resistance appeared to be weakening in some sectors. He paused, his damaged antenna twitching involuntarily. But something felt wrong. The humans weren't behaving like a defeated species. Instead of surrendering or negotiating, they were retreating to more defensible positions and changing their tactics in ways that defied our understanding of warfare. A senior sergeant with battle scars across his carapace leaned forward. What kind of tactical changes, Elder? They stopped trying to hold territory, Zixthara replied. Instead, they began what they called asymmetric warfare. Small groups of humans would strike at our supply lines, communication networks, and isolated patrols, then disappear before we could respond. They turned their knowledge of local terrain into a weapon. His compound eyes grew distant as he relived the memories. I remember the first time we encountered their guerrilla fighters. My reconnaissance unit was patrolling what our maps indicated was a pacified agricultural region. Peaceful farmland, according to our intelligence. No strategic value, no military installations. The old veteran's mandibles clicked nervously. We were attacked by farmers. Ordinary civilians who had hidden weapons in their grain storage facilities and ammunition in their root cellars. They knew every trail, every hiding spot, every weakness in the local terrain. When we tried to pursue them, they vanished into underground tunnel networks we never knew existed. One of the younger officers interrupted. But surely your aerial reconnaissance could track them. Zixthara's laugh was harsh. The humans had prepared for that too. They had created false heat signatures to confuse our thermal imaging, used reflective materials to disrupt our optical sensors, and somehow learned to mask their biological signatures from our lifeform detectors. It was as if they could become invisible whenever they chose. He took another drink, his hands trembling slightly. But the worst part was their communication network. We had destroyed all their major broadcasting stations and communication satellites, cutting off their ability to coordinate large-scale operations. Or so we thought. The cantina's atmosphere grew heavier as Zixthara's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They were using something called ham radio and underground cable networks we hadn't detected. These humans were coordinating attacks across entire continents using technology we considered obsolete. While we relied on quantum communication arrays, they were defeating us with devices their ancestors had built generations earlier. A young technician with nervous tremors spoke up. But Elder, how could primitive communication technology be effective against our jamming systems? Because we had designed our jamming to disrupt advanced communication methods, Zixthara replied. The humans were using frequencies and protocols so basic that our electronic warfare systems didn't even recognize them as threats. They were hiding in the gaps of our own technological superiority. His voice began to shake as he continued. The attacks escalated gradually. First, isolated patrols would disappear without any distress signals. Then supply convoys would be ambushed by enemies who seemed to know exactly what cargo they carried and which routes they would take. Our forward bases began experiencing coordinated assaults that suggested intelligence gathering we couldn't explain. The old veteran gestured with one of his scarred arms. This damage came from what the humans called an improvised explosive device, a bomb made from agricultural fertilizer and fuel, hidden in what appeared to be an abandoned vehicle. When my patrol stopped to investigate, it detonated with enough force to destroy our entire hover. Transport. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft sound of someone's glass being set down too. Hard, but that wasn't the worst part. Zixthara continued. The worst part was that after the explosion, as my surviving soldiers were calling for medical evacuation, human civilians emerged from nearby buildings to attack us with primitive weapons. Kinetic firearms, bladed instruments, even thrown projectiles. They knew we were wounded and vulnerable, and they showed no mercy. One of the female officers leaned forward, her voice barely audible. Did you fight back? Of course we fought back, Zixthara replied, his tone growing bitter. We killed them all. Every human who attacked us, including what appeared to be their young and their elderly. But as we waited for evacuation, more humans arrived. Not soldiers, but ordinary civilians who had heard the gunfire and come to investigate. His compound eyes glazed over with the memory. They didn't run when they saw the bodies. They didn't surrender when they saw our weapons. Instead, they began gathering intelligence about our equipment, our injuries, our tactical positions. Even facing certain death, they were still thinking strategically about how to hurt us. The cantina had grown completely silent. Even the background ventilation system seemed to have stopped. That's when I realized we weren't fighting a military force anymore. Zixthara continued. We were fighting an entire species that had evolved beyond our understanding of warfare. Every human, regardless of age or profession, was a potential intelligence asset, a potential saboteur, a potential weapon. He finished his drink and immediately signaled for another. The High Command kept sending us reports about mopping up operations and final pacification efforts, but those of us on the ground knew better. We weren't conquering Earth, we were being slowly consumed by it. The young lieutenant who had been so confident at the beginning of the evening now looked physically ill. How long did the ground campaign continue? Zixthara's expression grew darker. 4 more cycles. 4 cycles of watching our forces get worn down by an enemy that refused to fight conventionally, refused to surrender, and refused to die quietly. By the end, we had learned to fear the sound of human laughter, because it usually meant they had prepared another trap we hadn't anticipated. He accepted his new drink with hands that shook visibly, but the real horror was yet to come. The humans were preparing something that would change the nature of warfare forever, something that would make our previous encounters look like training exercises. Zixthara's 5th drink arrived with unusual speed, the bartender having learned to anticipate the old veteran's needs. The crowd around him had grown larger, word spreading through the cantina that someone was finally telling the truth about the human war. Even off-duty officers from other species had gathered, their faces showing mixtures of fascination and horror. 7 cycles into the invasion, our intelligence division intercepted something that changed everything, Zixthara began, his voice now noticeably affected by the alcohol. Human communications had been speaking about something called Project Prometheus for months, but our translators couldn't determine what it meant. We assumed it was another defensive installation or perhaps a new weapon system. His scarred antenna twitched as he continued. We were wrong. Project Prometheus wasn't a defensive system. It was the humans' plan to take the war beyond their own planet. The silence that followed was absolute. Several glasses were set down as the implications began to sink in. You have to understand, Zixthara said, his compound eyes growing distant. No species we had ever encountered had attempted offensive operations while their homeworld was under occupation. The logical response to invasion is to focus all resources on defense, not waste them on impossible counterattacks. A grizzled sergeant from another species, a reptilian creature with dark scales, spoke up. But Elder, how could a primitive species launch attacks against superior forces in space? Zixthara's laugh was bitter and filled with pain. They didn't attack our ships. They attacked something far more valuable. Our supply lines, our reinforcement routes, our home colonies. The humans had been studying our star charts, our trade routes, our entire logistical network. He took a long drink, the liquid doing little to steady his nerves. While we were focused on conquering their single world, the humans had somehow launched vessels to attack our outlying settlements. Not warships, mind you. They couldn't build anything that could challenge our fleet directly. Instead, they sent what they called sleeper ships filled with civilian volunteers. The crowd leaned closer, sensing that the worst revelations were yet to come. These ships were essentially flying bombs, Zixthara continued. The humans had loaded them with nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological agents, and volunteers who knew they would never return home. Each ship was aimed at one of our supply depots or colonial outposts. His voice began to shake. The first attack hit mining station Kethvar 7, a facility that provided rare metals for our fleet's weapon systems. 300 Kethalarian workers died when a human ship, traveling at near light speed, impacted the station's central core. The explosion was visible from 7 star systems away. One of the younger officers spoke up, her voice barely audible. But how did they navigate interstellar distances with primitive technology? Determination, Zixthara replied simply. Pure, focused determination to hurt us regardless of the cost to themselves. The humans had calculated that every supply depot they destroyed would force us to divert resources from their homeworld to protect our other territories. He gestured with one of his damaged arms. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what they put in those ships besides explosives. The humans had loaded their vessels with information about our weaknesses, our military protocols, our technological specifications. When their ships were destroyed, they scattered this intelligence throughout space where other species could find it. The cantina had grown so quiet that the sound of distant traffic seemed deafening. Within cycles, every species in the galaxy had detailed information about Kethalarian military capabilities. Zixthara continued. The humans had turned their suicide attacks into intelligence operations, sharing our secrets with potential enemies throughout known space. The reptilian sergeant hissed softly. That's strategically brilliant. Brilliant and terrifying, Zixthara agreed. The humans had realized they couldn't defeat us militarily, so they chose to ensure that even if they lost, we would be weakened enough that other species could challenge us in the future. They were thinking beyond their own survival to the long-term balance of power in the galaxy. He took another drink, his hands trembling noticeably. But Project Prometheus was more than just suicide attacks. The humans had also prepared something they called cultural packages. Information about their history, their values, their refusal to surrender. They were spreading the idea of total resistance throughout the galaxy. One of the younger soldiers leaned forward. What kind of impact did that have? Zixthara's expression grew darker. Other species began questioning why they had submitted to Kethalarian authority so easily. Rebellion started erupting in territories we had controlled peacefully for generations. The humans had turned their defeat into a galactic uprising. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I remember receiving intelligence reports about colonial uprisings on 12 different worlds. Species that had never shown aggressive tendencies were suddenly attacking our administrators and military personnel. They were using human tactics, human strategies, human refusal to accept defeat. The old veteran's compound eyes glazed over as he relived the memories. The High Command was facing a choice no military leader ever wants to make. Continue the expensive war on Earth while dealing with rebellions throughout our territory, or abandon the invasion and focus on maintaining control of our existing empire. He paused, his breathing becoming labored. But the humans weren't finished. While we were debating strategy, they launched their final phase of Project Prometheus, something that would make everything we had experienced look like a minor skirmish. The bartender, who had been listening with growing horror, accidentally dropped another glass. The sound echoed through the silent cantina like a gunshot. The humans had prepared what they called generation ships. Zixthara continued. Massive vessels designed to carry human populations to other star systems. But these weren't refugee ships fleeing a lost war. They were invasion fleets aimed at establishing human colonies throughout the galaxy. The implications hit the crowd like a physical blow. Several officers exchanged worried glances. You have to understand the psychological impact, Zixthara said, his voice growing stronger despite the alcohol. Here was a species that was losing a war on their own homeworld, yet they were simultaneously preparing to spread their civilization to dozens of other systems. They weren't thinking about survival. They were thinking about expansion. He finished his drink and stared at the empty glass. The humans had calculated that even if Earth fell, their species would survive and continue fighting from new worlds throughout the galaxy. They were turning defeat into a diaspora that would make them impossible to completely eliminate. The silence that followed was filled with the weight of realization. The young soldiers around Zixthara were beginning to understand that they weren't just hearing about a historical conflict. They were learning about an enemy that still existed, scattered throughout space, carrying the memory of how to hurt a superior force. The sixth drink came without being ordered, and Zixthara accepted it with hands that had grown steadier as the evening progressed. Around him, the cantina had filled to capacity, word having spread throughout the station that a human war veteran was finally telling the complete story. Military personnel from a dozen different species had gathered, their faces showing the same mixture of fascination and dread. The end came not with a great battle or a heroic last stand, Zixthara began, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to press down on everyone present. It came with a simple communication from Earth's surface, broadcast on all frequencies simultaneously. He paused, his compound eyes reflecting the cantina's dim lighting. The message was from their planetary leader, a female called the President. She spoke directly to our fleet, not to our commanders or our diplomats, but to our common soldiers. And what she said changed the course of galactic history. The crowd leaned forward, sensing that the climax of the story was approaching. She offered us a choice, Zixthara continued. Complete withdrawal from Earth in exchange for a guarantee that human expansion into the galaxy would be peaceful rather than military. Refuse, and they would ensure that every species in known space received the technology and knowledge necessary to challenge Kethalarian supremacy. A young intelligence officer with bright markings spoke up. But that's essentially blackmail. Yes, Zixthara replied simply. And it was the most effective military strategy any species had ever employed against us. The humans had studied our empire's structure so thoroughly that they understood exactly how to threaten its stability. He took a sip of his drink, his expression growing distant. You have to understand the position we were in. 9 cycles of warfare had cost us more ships and personnel than the previous 50 cycles of conquest combined. Our colonial territories were experiencing unprecedented unrest. Our economy was straining under the cost of maintaining such a distant campaign. The old veteran's mandibles clicked nervously. But more than that, the humans had demonstrated something that terrified our leadership. They had shown that a technologically inferior species could still threaten a galactic empire if they were willing to sacrifice everything for their goals. He gestured with one of his scarred arms. The High Command realized that continuing the war would require committing our entire military to Earth's conquest, leaving our other territories vulnerable to the rebellions that human propaganda had inspired. The silence in the cantina was so complete that the sound of ventilation systems seemed loud. Admiral Kethvar made the decision that saved the Cathalarian Empire, Zixthara continued. He ordered complete withdrawal from the Sol system in exchange for human agreement to limit their expansion to designated sectors of space. One of the senior sergeants leaned forward. But Elder, wasn't that essentially admitting defeat to a primitive species? Zixthara's laugh was bitter. Primitive? After 9 cycles of warfare, none of us considered the humans primitive anymore. We had learned to respect their tactical innovation, their strategic thinking, their absolute refusal to accept defeat. His voice grew stronger as he continued. The withdrawal took 3 cycles to complete. During that time, we maintained a ceasefire, while human representatives worked with our diplomats to establish what they called the Geneva Accords, treaties that would govern future interactions between our species. He paused, his breathing becoming more labored. But even during the ceasefire, the humans continued to demonstrate their strategic thinking. They used the time to rebuild their military infrastructure, not for further warfare but as a guarantee that any future aggression would be met with the same level of resistance. The crowd shifted uncomfortably as the implications sank in. They also shared selected technologies with other species, Zixthara continued. Not enough to threaten galactic stability, but sufficient to ensure that no single empire could dominate the galaxy as completely as we had before. A female officer with blue markings spoke up. What kind of technologies? Defensive systems mostly, Zixthara replied. Shield generators, early warning networks, communication protocols that couldn't be easily jammed. The humans were creating a galaxy where conquest would be more difficult for everyone, including themselves. His compound eyes grew distant again, but perhaps the most significant thing they shared was their philosophy of resistance, the idea that any species, regardless of technological level, could defend itself if it was willing to pay the necessary price. He took another drink, his hand steady now despite the alcohol. Within generations, the balance of power in the galaxy had shifted. No empire could maintain control through fear alone anymore, because every species had learned the human lesson that defeat is only final if you accept it. The cantina had grown so quiet that the sound of someone's breathing seemed loud. The Cathalarian Empire still exists, Zixthara continued, but it's no longer the dominant force it once was. We rule through negotiation and mutual benefit rather than conquest and intimidation, and every time our leaders consider military action against another species, they remember the lesson of Earth. One of the younger soldiers spoke up nervously. What lesson was that, Elder? Zixthara's expression grew serious. That some victories are more costly than defeat. That some species are more dangerous when cornered than when free. That the humans had taught us something we never expected to learn. That sometimes the wisest course of action is to leave a sleeping enemy undisturbed. He finished his drink and set the glass down with finality. The humans kept their agreement. Their expansion into the galaxy has been peaceful, their colonies established through negotiation rather than conquest, but they've also made it clear that they remember the war, remember the lessons they learned about fighting superior forces. The old veteran's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and every species in the galaxy knows that if pushed too far, the humans are still capable of the kind of warfare that brought the Cathalarian Empire to its knees. The silence that followed was filled with the weight of understanding. The young soldiers around Zixthara were no longer the confident warriors who had entered the cantina hours earlier. They had learned something that would change their perspective on warfare forever, that technology and superior numbers meant nothing against an enemy that refused to be defeated. Zixthara declined the offer of a 7th drink, his story nearly complete and his audience hanging on every word. The cantina had become a gathering place for military personnel from across the station, with beings from dozens of species listening in respectful silence to the old veteran's final revelations. 50 cycles have passed since the withdrawal. Zixthara began, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated years and hard-won wisdom. 50 cycles during which the galaxy has learned to live with the knowledge that the humans are still out there, still expanding, still remembering. He looked around the crowd, meeting the eyes of younger soldiers who would carry these lessons into whatever conflicts the future might bring. The peace treaty has held, mostly because every species understands the alternative. The humans established colonies in 47 different star systems, each one a potential base for the kind of warfare they demonstrated on Earth. But they've also become traders, diplomats, scientists, and explorers. The old veteran's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. I've had the opportunity to meet humans during the peace negotiations and subsequent diplomatic missions. They're remarkably ordinary beings when not pushed to warfare. They laugh, they mourn their dead, they form emotional attachments to their companions. In many ways, they're not so different from us. One of the younger officers leaned forward. But Elder, if they're so ordinary, how did they fight so effectively against superior forces? Zixithara was quiet for a long moment, considering his response. That's the most terrifying thing about humans. Their capacity for absolute warfare isn't some genetic abnormality or cultural aberration. It's simply what they do when survival is at stake. Any human, from the most peaceful scientist to the youngest civilian, can become a weapon if threatened sufficiently. He gestured toward the cantina's windows, beyond which lay the vast expanse of space where human colonies now flourished. During the diplomatic negotiations, I asked their chief representative about this, how their species could transform so completely from peaceful civilians to absolute warriors and back again. The crowd waited in silence for his answer. She told me something I've never forgotten. Zixithara continued. She said that humans don't fight because they enjoy warfare or because they're naturally aggressive. They fight because they refuse to accept that superior force automatically grants the right to rule. They believe that freedom is worth any sacrifice, including their own extinction. His voice grew thoughtful, but she also told me something else. She said that humans prefer peace to war, cooperation to conflict, building to destroying. The warfare we experienced was not their natural state, but their response to what they perceived as an existential threat. A senior sergeant from another species spoke up. But Elder, doesn't that make them even more dangerous? An enemy that only fights when cornered? Yes and no, Zixithara replied. It makes them dangerous to those who would threaten them, but it also makes them valuable allies to those who treat them with respect. The humans have honored every treaty they've signed, aided species under attack by pirates or natural disasters, and shared technologies that benefit everyone. He paused, his compound eyes reflecting the cantina's lighting. The galaxy is safer now because of human influence, not despite it. Other species have learned the lessons of defensive warfare, making conquest more difficult for aggressive empires. But they've also learned the value of cooperation, trade, and mutual respect. The old veteran's expression grew serious. However, we must never forget the lessons of the war. The humans demonstrated that any species, no matter how primitive it might appear, can become dangerous if pushed beyond tolerance. They also showed us that our technological superiority doesn't guarantee victory against an enemy that thinks differently about acceptable costs. One of the younger soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Elder, do you think there will ever be another war with humans? Zixithara considered the question carefully. Only if someone is foolish enough to threaten their existence again. The humans have made it clear that they will defend themselves and their allies, but they have no interest in conquest for its own sake. They seem content to explore, trade, and build rather than dominate. His voice grew stronger, but they've also made it clear that they remember the lessons they learned during our war. Every human colony has defensive capabilities that far exceed what their population would normally require. Every human vessel carries more weapons than necessary for routine operations. They're prepared for warfare even while hoping for peace. The cantina's atmosphere had grown contemplative as the implications of Zixithara's words sank in, the most important lesson. The old veteran continued, is that we must never again make the mistake of underestimating another species based on their apparent technological level. The humans taught us that intelligence, determination, and willingness to sacrifice can overcome almost any material disadvantage. He looked around the room one final time, but they also taught us something positive. That species can change, can grow beyond their aggressive instincts, can choose cooperation over conquest. The galaxy is more peaceful now than it was before the human war, partly because everyone understands the true cost of aggressive warfare. Zixithara stood slowly, his movements stiff with age and old injuries. Remember what I've told you tonight. Remember that warfare should always be the last resort, not the first response to disagreement. Remember that every species you encounter might be capable of surprising you, for better or worse. The crowd began to disperse slowly, each being carrying with them new understanding of what humanity represented in the galactic community. Some felt fear at the implications of human defensive capabilities. Others felt reassurance that aggressive empires would face determined resistance. As Zixthara prepared to leave, the young lieutenant who had been so confident at the evening's beginning approached him. "Elder," the young soldier said quietly, "thank you for sharing these memories. I understand now why the peace with humans is so important to maintain." Zixthara nodded slowly. "Peace is always preferable to war, young one. But if war becomes inevitable, remember that victory depends not just on superior technology or numbers, but on understanding your enemy's motivations and capabilities. The humans taught us that some enemies are more dangerous when cornered than when free." He walked slowly toward the cantina's exit, his scarred form a living reminder of the cost of underestimating human determination. Behind him, the conversations had resumed, but they were quieter now, more thoughtful, carrying the weight of lessons learned from the most unexpected war in galactic history. The humans had won something more valuable than military victory. They had won respect, and with it the guarantee that their species would never again face the kind of existential threat that had nearly destroyed them. In saving themselves, they had taught the galaxy a lesson that would echo through the generations, that freedom is worth fighting for, and that those who fight for it with everything they have are not easily defeated.